Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Charleston. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing what places and what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The winter of 1842 in Charleston, South Carolina, carried with it an unusual chill. Not the kind that merely stings the skin, but the sort that seeps into the bones and lingers, the sort that makes old houses creak with memories better left undisturbed. It was during this particular winter that Josephine Caldwell, widow of the late shipping magnate Howard Caldwell, made a purchase that would eventually unravel the carefully constructed facade of one of Charleston's most respected families. Josephine lived in a handsome three-story home on Church Street, just north of Broad, in what locals called the Borough. The house had belonged to the Caldwell family for 3 generations. White columns framed the entrance, and wrought iron railings adorned balconies that overlooked carefully maintained gardens. To passers-by, the Caldwell residence represented old money, respectability, and the finest of Charleston society. But those who worked within its walls knew the silence that had descended upon the home since Howard Caldwell's passing 2 years prior. The widowed Josephine rarely entertained any more. The regular Sunday gatherings, once hosted by the Caldwells, had ceased. The ballroom on the 2nd floor remained closed, its mirrors draped in cloth. Instead, Josephine spent her days in the east-facing sitting room, reviewing household accounts, corresponding with distant relatives, and occasionally receiving her sister, Margaret, who lived 3 blocks away on Meeting Street. The staff had been reduced to essential personnel: a cook, 2 house servants, a groundskeeper, and a coachman. According to accounts from Eleanor Miller, the wife of Josephine's solicitor, the widow had grown unusually thin in the months following her husband's death. Her once vibrant auburn hair had dulled, and premature streaks of grey appeared at her temples. She wore only black, as was customary for widows, but there was something about Josephine's mourning that struck those who knew her as excessive, even obsessive. What few realized was that Howard Caldwell's death at 49 had been unexpected. A heart seizure, the physician had declared. Howard had been found one morning in his study by the housemaid, slumped over his desk, a half-written letter still beneath his hand. The letter, addressed to a business associate in Philadelphia, contained nothing of note. Nothing, at least, that explained why Josephine had ordered the study sealed immediately after the funeral. For 2 years, no one entered that room. The key remained on a chain around Josephine's neck, alongside her wedding band. The staff was instructed never to dust or clean the space. When visitors inquired about the locked door on the 1st floor, Josephine explained that it contained memories too painful to disturb. Most accepted this explanation without question. Grief, after all, manifests in peculiar ways. It was against this backdrop that Josephine Caldwell appeared at the auction block on Market Street on the 17th of December, 1842. The auction that day was what locals called a recovery sale, slaves being sold by creditors to recover debts after the death of their owner. In this case, the deceased was Tobias Green, a failed rice planter whose properties had been foreclosed upon. The auction attracted few serious buyers. The weather was poor, and Green's remaining slaves were considered of little value, the strong and healthy ones having been sold off years earlier to keep the plantation afloat. Thomas Jenkins, who served as Josephine's coachman for 23 years and left a brief memoir before his death in 1876, recalled that his mistress had never before attended such an event. Slave purchases for the Caldwell household had always been handled by Howard or his business manager. Jenkins wrote that he was instructed to bring the carriage around mid-morning and was surprised when Josephine directed him to the auction site. Mrs. said nothing during the ride, Jenkins wrote. She sat straight-backed, staring ahead, clutching her reticule like it might fly away in the wind. When we arrived, I helped her down, and she instructed me to wait. She returned perhaps 40 minutes later, followed by a slave girl who could hardly walk. The child, though I later learned she was nearly 18, was so thin and sickly-looking that I wondered if she would survive the carriage ride home. The girl's name, according to the bill of sale preserved in the Charleston County Historical Archives, was Sarah. She was purchased for the sum of $18, a fraction of what a healthy female slave would have cost. The document described her as damaged goods and noted that she suffered from a persistent cough and general weakness of constitution. Why Josephine Caldwell, who had shown no interest in expanding her household staff, would purchase such a seemingly worthless slave puzzled those few who witnessed the transaction. Eleanor Miller's diary, discovered during renovations to her former home in 1961, provides some insight. In an entry dated December 18, 1842, she wrote, "Visited Josephine today and found her strangely animated. She has purchased a slave girl, a sickly thing that looks half dead already. When I inquired as to the purpose of such an acquisition, Josephine merely smiled and said, 'She has familiar eyes, Eleanor.' So very familiar. I confess the statement unsettled me, as did the way Josephine watched the girl as she served us tea with trembling hands. What happened in the weeks that followed has been pieced together from various sources. Jenkins' memoir, Eleanor Miller's diary, and fragments of correspondence between Josephine and her sister Margaret. The slave girl, whom the household staff began calling Sarah Bell due to her unusually light complexion, was not assigned to the usual quarters. Instead, Josephine had a small room adjacent to her own bedchamber prepared. This arrangement was unusual enough to cause whispers below stairs, but what followed was even more perplexing. According to Jenkins, Sarah Bell was given duties that kept her close to Josephine throughout the day. She served as a lady's maid, despite having no training for such work. She took her meals separately from the other servants, often eating leftovers from Josephine's own plate. And most strangely, Josephine insisted on personally tending to the girl's health, administering tonics and medicines with her own hands. Eleanor Miller's diary entry from January 3, 1843 notes, "Josephine has developed an unnatural fixation with her new slave girl. She speaks of little else. The girl's health, she claims, is improving under her care, though to my eye the child still looks like a strong wind might carry her away. Today, Josephine insisted I observe how the girl's hands resemble Howard's, long-fingered and elegant. I saw no such resemblance and worry for my dear friend's state of mind." Margaret Rutledge, Josephine's sister, expressed similar concerns in a letter to her husband, who was traveling on business in New York. "I fear Josephine has found a peculiar method of processing her grief. She has convinced herself that this slave girl somehow shares a connection with Howard. She studies the girl's features with an intensity that borders on obsession. Yesterday, she insisted the girl sit with us in the parlor while we took tea, not to serve, but to be observed. It was most irregular, and I left feeling deeply disturbed." The turning point came on January 21, 1843. According to Jenkins, Josephine had retired to her room early, complaining of a headache. Sarah Bell was sent to bring her mistress a pot of willow bark tea, a common remedy for pain. What happened next was recounted by Harriet Davis, one of the house servants, to Eleanor Miller, who recorded it in her diary. Harriet says she heard a scream from the mistress's room, not of pain, but of rage. It was followed by the sound of breaking china, and then silence. When Harriet ventured to check on her mistress some minutes later, she found Josephine standing over the slave girl, who was on her knees collecting pieces of the broken teapot. Around the girl's neck was a thin leather cord, and from it hung a gold ring that had slipped out from beneath her dress. Harriet recognized it immediately as Master Howard's signet ring, the one that had supposedly been buried with him. The discovery of Howard Caldwell's ring around the neck of a slave girl purchased from an unrelated estate sale raised questions that would haunt Charleston society for years to come. How had this girl come into possession of a ring supposedly interred with its owner? What was the nature of the familiar eyes that had drawn Josephine to purchase this particular slave? And perhaps most disturbingly, what was the true connection between Howard Caldwell, a respected businessman, and Sarah Bell, a sickly slave girl from a failed rice plantation? In the days that followed, the Caldwell household fell into disarray. Jenkins reported that Josephine locked herself in her room for 24 hours, refusing meals and visitors. When she emerged, she immediately summoned Reverend Thomas Parker of St. Philip's Church and her solicitor, James Miller. The three met privately in the still-sealed study, which Josephine opened for the first time since her husband's death. Eleanor Miller's diary provides a second-hand account of what transpired based on what her husband shared with her. James returned from the Caldwell house ashen-faced. He would not speak of what was discussed, saying only that matters of a delicate nature were being addressed. When I pressed him, he said something that chilled me. "Some sins cannot be buried, Eleanor, no matter how deep the grave." On January 25th, Jenkins was instructed to bring the carriage around before dawn. He observed Josephine and Sarah Bell enter the vehicle, the latter now dressed not as a servant, but in a plain traveling dress of decent quality. They carried a single trunk between them. Josephine handed Jenkins a letter addressed to her sister and instructed him to deliver it after midday. They departed in the direction of the Charleston docks, where port records indicate 2 passages were booked on the merchant vessel Northern Star, bound for Boston. The letter to Margaret, which has been preserved in the Rutledge family papers, read simply, "Dearest sister, by the time you read this, I will have left Charleston, perhaps forever. What I have discovered cannot be undone or forgotten. Sarah is Howard's daughter, born to a woman he kept in secret for years at Green's plantation. The resemblance once seen cannot be unseen. I go now to make what amends I can for my husband's sins and my own willful blindness. Do not seek us out. All legal matters have been arranged with James Miller. The house and its contents I leave to you. May you find more happiness within its walls than I did. Your loving sister, Josephine." The revelation sent ripples through Charleston society. Howard Caldwell, it seemed, had fathered a child with a slave woman and had somehow maintained this secret throughout his marriage. The discovery raised uncomfortable questions about other prominent men in the community and cast a shadow over Howard's previously unblemished reputation. The study, finally opened after 2 years, yielded more secrets. According to an inventory conducted by James Miller, it contained documentation of regular payments made to Tobias Green, presumably to maintain Sarah Bell and her mother in relative comfort. There were also letters from Green warning that his financial situation was becoming desperate and that he could no longer guarantee their safety or secrecy. The last such letter was dated just 3 weeks before Howard's fatal heart seizure. Most damning was a half-finished letter found not in the study, but in a hidden compartment of Josephine's writing desk, discovered by Margaret as she prepared to take ownership of the house. Written in Josephine's hand and addressed to Howard, it read, "I know everything. The girl at Green's plantation, the money, the visits you claimed were business. Did you think I would not discover the truth? Your betrayal is complete. I cannot bear to look at you, knowing that while I suffered through 3 miscarriages, you created a life elsewhere and nurtured it in secret. The tonic I have added to your evening brandy will—" The letter ended there, unfinished. The implication was clear, yet unprovable. Howard Caldwell's heart seizure might not have been natural at all. Had Josephine discovered her husband's infidelity and secret child and taken matters into her own hands? Had guilt then driven her to seek out the child after Green's death, perhaps initially with malicious intent that somehow transformed into a distorted form of atonement? These questions would never be answered definitively. Josephine and Sarah Bell disappeared into the north. Despite Margaret's assurances that she would not look for them, private investigators were dispatched to Boston. They found that the two women had indeed arrived, but had quickly moved on, possibly to Canada. The trail grew cold. For years afterward, rumors circulated. Some claimed to have seen Josephine in Montreal, living modestly as a seamstress with a young woman who might have been Sarah Bell. Others insisted they had traveled to Europe. A letter postmarked from London in 1851 and signed simply J arrived for Margaret, containing nothing but a pressed flower and a small ivory cameo that had belonged to their mother. Whether this was truly from Josephine remains uncertain. The Caldwell house on Church Street passed through several owners in the decades that followed. During renovations in 1927, workers discovered a small chamber beneath the floorboards of what had been Howard's study. The space contained a cot, a chamber pot, and scratches on the wall that appeared to be a rudimentary calendar covering approximately 2 weeks. The discovery was noted in the Charleston Daily Courier, but was quickly forgotten as mere curiosity from a bygone era. In 1959, a historian researching antebellum Charleston came across medical records belonging to Dr. William Harper, who had treated the Caldwell family. Among them was a notation dated 6 weeks before Howard's death. Visited Caldwell residence at Mrs. C's request. Mr. C showing symptoms of slow poisoning, weakness, confusion, stomach complaints. Recommended change of diet, no alcohol. Mrs. C unusually attentive during examination. The last verified document relating to this case is a death notice from a Boston newspaper dated March 1867. Passed away peacefully, Mrs. Sarah Winters, age 43, formerly of Charleston, South Carolina. Survived by her guardian, Miss Josephine Brown, who requests privacy during this difficult time. The names Winters and Brown were common enough to provide anonymity, yet specific enough to be identifiable to anyone familiar with the case. If this was indeed Sarah Bell, she had lived to middle age despite her supposedly frail constitution, and Josephine, now using her mother's maiden name, had remained with her until the end. What truly happened within the walls of that Charleston home in the winter of 1842 remains a matter of speculation. Was Josephine Caldwell a murderer who killed her husband in a rage over his infidelity, only to be haunted by her crime into seeking out his illegitimate daughter? Or was she a victim herself, a woman betrayed not only by her husband's affair but by the society that enabled such secrets? Perhaps most disturbing is the fate of Sarah Bell before her purchase by Josephine. Records from Green's plantation, uncovered during historical research in the 1960s, indicate that a female slave matching Sarah's description was frequently loaned to visitors. The practice was not uncommon on failing plantations desperate for income. Was Howard Caldwell more than just a biological father who provided financial support from afar? Did his regular visits to the plantation serve a more sinister purpose? The gold signet ring that revealed the connection remains unaccounted for. It was not among Josephine's possessions left behind, nor was it listed in Sarah Bell's effects in the Boston death notice. Some speculate that it lies at the bottom of Charleston Harbor, thrown there by Josephine during their escape. Others believe it may have been sold to fund their new life in the north. Charleston has changed much since 1842, but the former Caldwell house still stands on Church Street. Current owners report no unusual occurrences, though visitors occasionally comment on a persistent chill in what was once Howard's study, even on the warmest of summer days. A portrait of Howard Caldwell hangs in the Charleston Historical Society, showing a handsome man with confident eyes and a slight, satisfied smile, the face of a man who believed his secrets would die with him. As for Josephine and Sarah Bell, their true story died with them. We are left only with fragments, a bill of sale, a few diary entries, letters with veiled meanings, and a gold ring that linked two worlds that Charleston society fought desperately to keep separate. In their disappearance, they became ghosts of a sort, not supernatural but historical, shadows that flicker at the edges of a community's collective memory, reminding us that beneath the polished facade of any society lie secrets that some would kill to protect and others would sacrifice everything to expose. The next time you walk the streets of Charleston's historic district, pause for a moment outside the old homes with their perfect symmetry and well-maintained gardens. Consider what secrets might lie behind those elegant facades. For as the story of Josephine Caldwell and Sarah Bell reminds us, the most haunting horrors are not those of supernatural origin, but those born from the darkest corners of the human heart, preserved and passed down through generations like a family heirloom too shameful to display yet too valuable to discard. In 1968, during cataloguing of artifacts at the Massachusetts Historical Society, researchers discovered a small leather-bound journal believed to have belonged to Josephine Caldwell, though it was signed only with the initial J. The final entry, dated February 1868, less than a year after Sarah Bell's death, reads, "I have lived two lives. In one, I was a respected wife who became a murderess. In the other, I became mother to my husband's secret child. I am neither the woman Charleston knew, nor the woman Boston believes me to be. The truth, like Howard's ring, lies somewhere between, a circle with no beginning and no end." The journal was archived and later microfilmed, but the original was lost during a storage facility fire in 1967. Like so much of this story, it exists now only as an echo, a whisper of something that might have been true or might have been fabricated, a ghost story without a ghost, but with victims and perpetrators whose roles blur with each retelling. The Massachusetts Historical Society has carefully preserved what few items remained from Josephine's life in Boston. Among them is a photograph, dated around 1865, showing an older woman seated beside a younger one. Their names are not recorded, but the archivist's notes suggest they are J.B. and S.W. of Charleston origin. The older woman's face is partially turned away from the camera, a common technique used by those who did not wish to be easily identified in photographs. The younger woman looks directly at the lens, her expression unreadable, her hands folded carefully in her lap. No rings are visible on either woman's fingers. What compelled Josephine to seek out Sarah Bell remains perhaps the most intriguing aspect of this case. The prevailing theory, supported by Eleanor Miller's diary entries, suggests that Josephine initially attended the auction out of morbid curiosity, after discovering letters that revealed her husband's secret relationship. She had not intended to purchase the girl, but was struck by the undeniable resemblance to Howard. The same familiar eyes, she mentioned to Eleanor. Dr. Margaret Thornton, a historian who studied the case extensively in the 1950s, proposed a more complex motivation in her unpublished manuscript, Veiled Lives, Women's Secrets in Antebellum Charleston. Thornton suggests that Josephine, unable to bear children and devastated by multiple miscarriages, may have seen in Sarah Bell both the child she could never have and a living extension of the husband she had loved and lost, or perhaps murdered. The psychological complexity of Josephine Caldwell's actions defies simple explanation, Thornton wrote. Here was a woman who may have poisoned her husband upon discovering his infidelity, only to then seek out and essentially adopt his illegitimate daughter. Was this an act of atonement, a desperate attempt to preserve some connection to Howard? Or perhaps a form of control, possessing the living evidence of her husband's betrayal rather than allowing it to exist beyond her reach? The discovery of the ring around Sarah Bell's neck marks the narrative climax of this strange history. but it raises more questions than it answers. Howard Caldwell had been buried with this ring, according to the funeral director's records preserved in St. Philip's Church archives. The only way Sarah Bell could have obtained it was if it had been removed from Howard's body before burial, or if Howard had never been buried with it at all. A third possibility emerges from an interview conducted in 1953 with Emmeline Jackson, who claimed to be the granddaughter of Harriet Davis, one of the Caldwell house servants. According to family stories passed down to her, Sarah Bell's mother had been Howard's longtime mistress, and the ring had been given to her as a token years earlier. Before her death, likely from the same consumption that plagued her daughter, she had passed the ring to Sarah Bell as proof of her paternity, insurance against the uncertain future facing a mixed-race child on a failing plantation. The question of what happened in Howard Caldwell's study on the night of his death remains unanswered. The unfinished letter found in Josephine's desk strongly suggests she had poisoned her husband's brandy, but no autopsy was performed, and the body was interred quickly, as was customary in the warm southern climate. James Miller, Josephine's solicitor, may have suspected the truth, but chose to protect his client. His own journal, found among his effects after his death in 1865, contains a cryptic entry dated 3 days after Howard's funeral. "A man's sins often precipitate his end, whether by divine judgment or human hand. In either case, justice of a sort is served." Charleston society, while shocked by the revelations following Josephine's departure, quickly closed ranks. The story was hushed up, mentioned only in private correspondence and behind closed doors. The scandal threatened too many other prominent families who maintained similar arrangements. Within a year, Howard Caldwell's name was rarely mentioned, and Josephine was referred to as the widow who took leave of her senses. A convenient explanation that absolved the community of deeper examination. Sarah Bell's life before her purchase by Josephine can only be partially reconstructed through plantation records. Born around 1824 to a house slave named Mary at Green's plantation, she was noted in ledgers as being of mixed parentage. Her listed father was unknown, though regular payments from Howard Caldwell beginning shortly after her birth suggest otherwise. Unlike other slave children, she was not assigned to field work, instead serving in the main house and receiving basic education from Green's wife, who taught her to read, despite laws forbidding such instruction. When Green's plantation began to fail in the late 1830s, conditions deteriorated for all his slaves, including Sarah Bell. Medical records indicate she contracted tuberculosis around 1841, the persistent cough noted in her bill of sale. By the time Josephine purchased her in December 1842, most considered her unlikely to survive another year, an assessment that proved incorrect, as the Boston death notice places her death 25 years later. What changed in Sarah Bell's condition? How did a woman expected to die within months live to middle age? Medical records from Boston, discovered during research for an 1895 study on tuberculosis treatment, provide a clue. A patient identified as S.W., formerly of South Carolina, was treated by Dr. James Morrison, a pioneer in tuberculosis therapies, from 1844 to 1846. The treatment, involving fresh air, nutritious food, and carefully monitored rest, was considered revolutionary at the time, and resulted in what Morrison described as a remarkable recovery in a case previously thought hopeless. The cost of such specialized treatment would have been considerable. How did Josephine, who had left Charleston with limited funds, afford it? Property records from Boston indicate that in October 1843, a J. Brown sold a pearl necklace and matching earrings to Edgeworth's fine jewelry for the sum of $600, a substantial amount at the time. The description matches a set known to have belonged to Josephine Caldwell, a wedding gift from Howard. It seems Josephine sold her jewels to save the life of her husband's illegitimate daughter, an act of either tremendous compassion or complicated guilt. During their time in Boston, Josephine and Sarah Bell lived quietly in a modest home in the North End, according to city directories, from 1845 to 1867. Josephine established herself as a seamstress, specializing in fine ladies' garments, while Sarah, after her recovery, worked as a music teacher. Several of her students later recalled her as refined and somewhat melancholy, with hands that moved across the piano keys with unusual grace. None apparently knew of her early life as a slave or her connection to one of Charleston's prominent families. The two women attended the Unitarian Church on Hanover Street, where church records list them as regular contributors to abolitionist causes. They made no close friends, according to accounts from neighbors interviewed years later, but were regarded as respectable, if somewhat reserved, members of the community. They were, in the words of one neighbor, inseparable, more like mother and daughter than guardian and ward. What conversations took place between Josephine and Sarah Bell during those years? Did Sarah know or suspect that Josephine might have murdered her father? Did Josephine confess, or did she carry that secret to her grave? These questions can never be answered with certainty, but the fact that the two women remained together until Sarah's death suggests a complex bond that transcended their unusual circumstances. Sarah Bell's death from a recurrence of tuberculosis in 1867 was noted in Dr. Morrison's records as a case where medicine could only delay the inevitable. Josephine survived her by less than a year, dying in January 1868, reportedly of pneumonia. They share a grave in a small cemetery outside Boston, marked with a simple stone bearing only their adopted names and the inscription, "At Peace." The stone was erected not by any family member, but by a former piano student of Sarah's, who had maintained occasional contact with the women. After Josephine's departure, the Caldwell house in Charleston passed to her sister Margaret, who lived there until her death in 1879. Her diaries, which might have contained further insights into the case, were destroyed in a house fire in 1881. The current owners, who purchased the property in 1942, exactly 100 years after the events described, claim no knowledge of its history when they acquired it. They have, however, reported occasionally finding unfamiliar objects in the former study, items that they are certain were not there previously. Among these, a woman's glove, a sheet of blank stationery bearing the Caldwell monogram, and, most disturbingly, a small glass vial with traces of what laboratory analysis identified as laudanum, a common poison in the 19th century. The story of Josephine Caldwell and Sarah Bell eventually faded from Charleston's collective memory, overshadowed by the Civil War and its aftermath. It remained buried in archives and family papers until 1958, when historian Robert Manigault stumbled upon Eleanor Miller's diary while researching prominent Charleston families. His subsequent investigation brought the case back to light, though his findings were published only in an obscure academic journal and never reached a wide audience. In 1961, during renovations to the Caldwell house, workers discovered a hidden compartment beneath a window seat in what had been Josephine's bedroom. Inside was a small wooden box containing a portrait miniature of a young black woman in a blue dress, likely Sarah Bell's mother, and a lock of dark hair tied with blue ribbon. A note accompanying these items read simply, "Howard's heart. May God forgive us both." The current whereabouts of these artifacts are unknown. They disappeared from the contractor's office before they could be turned over to the Historical Society. The most recent development in this centuries-old mystery came in 1966,